to us all, the most sacred place on earth. Baba's one of the main reasons we're doing all of this, which is to share stories of people who met Baba, or to share their Baba stories, or stories from the Mandali, is so we can help spread Baba's message of love and truth. And Baba has said he's come to bring all religions together like beads on a string. Now, we usually start with the Master's Prayer, which is what we would like to do now. Zara,
Yes.
start with the Master's Prayer. I've already got it.
Okay, we can
Do we turn it?
Yeah. Sure.
I can turn this one off. We don't need that here. I don't think. I'll turn this off. Okay. O Parvartikar, the preserver and protector of all, you are without beginning and without end, non-dual, beyond comparison, and none can measure you. You are without color, without expression, without form, and without attributes. You are unlimited and unfathomable, beyond imagination and conception, eternal and imperishable. You are indivisible, and none can see you but with eyes divine. You always were, you always are, and you always will be. You are everywhere, you are in everything, and you are also beyond everywhere and beyond everything. You are in the firmament and in the depths. You are manifest and unmanifest, on all planes and beyond all planes. You are in the three worlds and also beyond the three worlds. You are imperceptible and independent. You are the Creator, the Lord of Lords, the knower of all minds and hearts. You are omnipotent and omnipresent. You are knowledge infinite, power infinite, and bliss infinite. You are the ocean of knowledge, all-knowing, infinitely knowing, the knower of the past, the present, and the future, and you are knowledge itself. You are all-merciful and eternally benevolent. You are the soul of souls, the one with infinite attributes. You are the Trinity of truth, knowledge, and bliss. You are the source of truth, the ocean of love. You are the Ancient One, the highest of the high. You are Prabhu and Parameshwar. You are the Beyond God and the Beyond Beyond God also. You are Parabrahma, Allah, Ilahi, Yezdan, Ahura Mazda, and God the Beloved. You are named Izad, the only one worthy of worship.
Avatar,
Meher Baba Ki Jai.
Okay, please start
Back on. Put this back on. Got it. So now, this is Ward Parks. He's one of the Mehrabad residents. And Ward he heard about Baba and became a Baba lover, I think, in 1970. Shortly after that, began coming to India all the time. Most talented man and most brilliant man. He was a professor and scholar, had gone to Harvard. And his story is, his work here, it's interesting how Baba, when he was working for his PhD, how Baba sort of led him into a field that ended up being perfectly needed here for the work he does here. So I'm going to let Ward Parks tell his story now.
Jai Baba, thank you for having me, and it's the nice opportunity to talk to one and all. So this is a little bit of how I came to Baba and how that path to Baba wound up bringing me here to the trust doing a kind of work with Baba's words, the editing of Baba's words, that is, as Baba seems to have arranged it, my background was so well suited for. So I came to Baba when I was 18, and here's a little bit of that story of how that happened. It's actually relevant. When I was a teenager, I was always kind of a reader, and read, like novels and books of philosophy, and I was very, actually, at the age of 13, I suddenly became very obsessed with that.
Very what?
Obsessed with, it was fiction, but it was the meaning of life. That was the phrase at the time. So I wanted to know the meaning of life. And after reading a little bit of this and that, I came to the conclusion that everything depended on whether God existed or not. And God obviously didn't exist. I never seriously gave consideration to why God might exist, but in those days it was kind of fashionable to poo-poo God. Existentialism was all the rage, and so I just took it for granted that there couldn't be all this evil in the world and so forth and so on if God existed. So obviously God didn't exist. And if God did not exist, this whole, you might say, interest or obsession with these sorts of questions really did wind up leading a lot of my course in later years. But if God didn't exist, the conclusion I came to was that nothing had any value or meaning, because nothing had a foundation. It's like I would sort of listen to what my teachers and parents and all these other fools around me, I remember Mark Twain saying something like, when I was 16, my parents didn't know anything. But by the time I was 25, they learned quite a lot. So that was kind of my story. I thought they were all a bunch of fools. And I would say, hear what they would say, well, you should live a good life and be a good person and make the world a better place. And I would think, well, if nothing has any value, why make the world a better place? If my life is inherently worthless and inherently meaningless because nothing can answer the problem of death. We all die, and when you die, everything you've done is annihilated. It might as well never have existed. So it's all inherently worthless. So I'm inherently worthless. Why should others be worth something? Because they're going to die too. Everything is completely empty. So I was a nihilist, that's the word for it. So given that to be the case, you see, if God does not exist, there would need to be something in the picture, in the universe, in the world, that has value. And then other things could acquire value by their relationship to it, by leaning on it. And the only thing, such a thing, could be God. But if God didn't exist, there was no point of value in the whole picture. So everything is worthless. Everything is completely valueless.
Now, how old were you when you began thinking this way?
I was about 14 or so. And I would read these books. Existentialism was all the rage at the time. But I would read a bit and kind of do my own philosophy out of it. I took it very seriously. I was a teenager, but I took it very seriously. So I thought, in that case, well, what should you do? The only thing you should do is do what you feel like that makes you happy. And don't have any concern at all for what's good or bad. If I would think, if I'm walking in a dark night and I see someone ahead of me and I know that person has piles and piles of money and I need money, well, I should just kill him and take it if I knew I could get away with it. And would I make that person, the world, a better place by doing that? Of course not. The world would become hell if everyone did like that. But who cares? The whole thing is worthless. There's no inherent value in anything. And all this talk about be a good boy and make the world a better place is a bunch of cowardice, because people wouldn't face the terrible reality of emptiness and worthlessness. But of course, I myself was too much of a chicken to actually live that way. As a matter of fact, I was always a really good student, and I was too much a chicken even to stop being a good student. If I had lived according to my philosophy, I would have gone around killing people, I suppose. But I wouldn't dare not do well on a test because my parents wouldn't like it. So on all this, I had all this high thoughts, and I myself was such a hypocrite, and I was very well aware of that. And what I did find, it was kind of romantic to think this way, you know, when you're a teenager, young teenager, but it got to me. It really got to me. And I became I would brood on this and obsess on this. I became very desperate, actually. And I would think, you know, our life is like, sort of like you're out in a windy, dark field, and you're holding like a little candle in your hand, and you're trying to keep it from blowing out. And maybe it blows out, or maybe it burns down, but in the end, it burns out, and it goes out, and that's it. That's what life is. There's nothing. It's just, you're doomed to darkness and infinite darkness forever, and you're finished. And nothing can redeem that situation. So I ended up becoming really bleak and really desperate. And I remember sitting up in my room one night, and I was just thinking, I used to start to think about, well, I might as well commit suicide. And I was really thinking about committing suicide. And one night, I just was thinking about this and said, there's no point in looking for the meaning of life anymore, because nothing like that exists. It's waste of time. It's impossible. I had never tried out the possibility that God could exist. I had just taken it for granted. God didn't exist, which would change everything as I knew it.
You're just looking at one side of the coin.
Yeah, and for some reason I never thought, well, I should really look at that other possibility, because that would completely transform the whole picture. You know, because everybody around me, my dad was a professor, and it was an intellectual class, and everybody in that world was completely scornful of religion and God, and you know, only stupid people. So I just somehow believed that. But that night I thought, there's no point in even thinking about this anymore. All I know is my life is worthless. Okay, that's a given. But so if I kill myself or not, it doesn't make any difference in the greater picture. But I know this, I don't like being miserable, and I would prefer to be happy. And I want to find some way of being happy, not just some set of circumstances that make me happy for the moment, but some actual way where the balance makes life worth living. And I said, I'll give myself 2 years to find something like that. And if I don't, I'll kill myself. That'll be the end of it. I decided that. And very soon after that, I was 16 then, a friend of mine, we would sit up and talk late into the night like teenage boys do about all these things. And he just told me that, oh, there are these people, the Zen Buddhists, and somehow they're always happy. They're never affected by anything. It was kind of a teenager's thumb your nose at the world version of what Zen Buddhists are. But I was sort of, well, I'd never heard of this before. I'd never heard of Buddhism, or I heard of Buddha, I guess. I never gave a moment's thought to it. But I thought, well, if they're like this possibility has to be inherent in the nature of things. If some people can do it, it must actually be a real route. And my friend said, yeah, that's true. So I went down to the bookstore. I was a reader. I would always read books on these sorts of subjects. And I got some books on Zen Buddhism. I sort of liked it, but it was kind of, Zen Buddhism is not this, it's not for this sort of person, and you have to distinguish it from this. It was very scholarly. And what the message I got was, Zen Buddhism is not for callow young Westerners looking for the meaning of life, which was me, basically. So I thought, okay, I was sort of liking it, but I said, whatever the Zen Buddhists have, they must have gotten it from Buddha, because he was the founder of Buddhism. So I got went down and bought some more books on the Buddha, life and teachings of Buddha, and I was blown away. I never had any religion as a kid. I never had any real exposure to Jesus or anything like that. That was not a part of my growing up. So I never met anyone like that before. And the the personality of Buddha and his way of dealing with people, and it just was really overpowering. And I read about his Four Noble Truths. That's one of the foundational doctrines of Buddhism. And the first noble truth is life is suffering. And man, had he got that one right. It's like, and it's not just that life is always miserable. That's not his point. His point is life is inherently dissatisfactory. And no matter what you do, there's always something in it that's unfulfilling. And that is what life is. And I had never heard anyone speak to the point so clearly that it wasn't just that I was having some sort of a problem, is that this is the innate condition of being a human being in this world. He was completely right. And then the second noble truth blew my mind away. He said there is a cause to suffering. I never even thought suffering, not just cause to sufferings like my parents were pissed at me or I didn't like doing my homework. I mean, I could see the causes for those kinds of pieces of suffering. But suffering itself has a cause, and the cause of suffering is desire. And I thought about it, and I thought, when you want things, you have to suffer. Well, if you get it, it never really satisfies you. And if you don't get it, you're dissatisfied because you didn't get what you wanted. That is the cause of suffering. And and the third noble truth is, if you annihilate suffering, you annihilate desire. And then the fourth noble truth is the Eightfold Path and his whole path of how to do that. So making a longer story short, I found that like lightning went off in my mind when I read about that. And I thought, well, this is obviously the truth. Obviously the truth of the human condition. See, Buddha didn't talk about God, and I was very anti-God. But he didn't mention God at all. But he talked about suffering and how to overcome suffering. So my whole life changed overnight. And instead of thinking about committing suicide all the time, I'd have all these pictures of Buddha in India and the various stories of his life. And then, and my parents didn't know what on earth was going on with me. I was always a good student. I was like the best student in my class, and it was very, a prep school, high pressure, high powered prep school. And everyone was expecting I would go on and have go to some great university and all of that. But I wasn't thinking about that at all. Although I was under a lot of pressure and somehow never had the guts to not try to do well in school. But then one day the thought came to me, it's not enough just to be thinking about this. I actually have to do this. And back in those days, this was the 60s, that didn't mean anything so jejune as signing up with a Buddhist sect or anything like that. I never even had met a Buddhist, so it wasn't really, but I thought I should have to actually renounce the world and become a beggar and seek nirvana. And when it came to that, I was really scared of it, because I thought, I freezed. I was up living in Rhode Island. Winters are really cold, and I'd freeze to death in the first winter. And of course I could go down and become a beggar in Florida, but that was kind of cheating. The point is to overcome, your own lower nature and not be affected by whether you freeze to death or not. So, and I didn't know if I had what it took to actually do that. So I gave myself some more time. I said, okay, everyone is expecting me. This is my senior year to, go to college. Actually, I got into Harvard. That was a real big deal. Everybody. I was suddenly this star and everything like that. And my parents were they were very concerned, but I would never say anything about what I was thinking. I would not say a word, but they couldn't figure out what was going on. But that part of it was good. So I said, okay, since everyone is expecting me to go to Harvard, I'll go to Harvard, finish my first year of my freshman year, and then I'll break the bad news, drop out of school, and pursue my career as a beggar and seek nirvana. So then
Very logical.
So all of a sudden, everything had changed for me, and I was no longer feeling that desperate feeling at all. But my senior year came to an end, and I had a surgery, and I was a bit laid up. And my parents didn't know what was going on, and they wanted to get me up. They figured my environment was probably the problem, so that we did this big driving trip. We lived in the East Coast, but all around the west of America. I didn't want to go at all, but they forced me. And I wound up really falling in love with the scenery of the West, the mountains and the deserts and the plains. And every night we would camp. It was a camping trip. And so we pitched the camp, and I would walk off into the woods or something, and because I had the idea Buddhists meditate. I didn't know the first thing about Buddhism. But I thought I was a very good Buddhist, but in point of fact, I was an idiot, So, but I would say a Buddhist meditate, and I had the idea you had to get in the lotus position, the lotus position, and in fact, it was agony for me, and I couldn't stay in it for more than 3 minutes, and I was kind of thinking, this doesn't augur very well if I'm going to seek nirvana and go through every kind of hardship, and I can't even stay in the lotus position for 5 minutes together. I don't know what the prospects are, but anyway, I would try to do it, and I would do a meditation. And the funny thing is, the meditation I came up with, no one told me, but it was a really good one. I would imagine I was sitting, and Buddha was sitting in front of me, about 6 feet away. And I was looking at him, and he was looking at me. And that was my meditation. It's actually a great meditation. And so I would do it, and then after 25 minutes, the mosquitoes would get to me, and I would read about these Buddhists who would meditate for 35 years in these terrible conditions and all of that, and if I couldn't manage mosquitoes for half an hour, once again, the prospects seemed doubtful, but despite that, we would go on these long driving things, and during the daytime, I don't know if you have this experience, but sometimes in a group of people, just people sitting around, and I'll suddenly get the feeling like something's touching my face, and I'll look, and somebody's looking at me, and I'll be aware that person has been looking, and you almost always, I get embarrassed, and the person gets embarrassed and look away. Well, I would get that feeling that someone was looking at me, driving in the car, and I would think, well, who is it? And then suddenly I would remember Buddha, and looking at Buddha and Buddha looking at me, and I would have the feeling that Buddha was looking at me, and it was the strangest feeling. I had never had such a feeling in my whole life, and I was an atheist, and I didn't actually believe that the Buddha existed. There's no such thing as God. It's just you transcend your bondage and attain a nirvana state. But it was such a powerful feeling. And then I remembered there was a book I had read about Buddha where one of his great disciples, Anand, who is the Erich at that time. And after Buddha died, Anand would be talking to the young Buddhists, and Anand would say that Buddha was still there, and you could still reach it, through inward searching. And the scholar who wrote the book said, oh, Anand, you didn't really understand Buddha's teachings. Buddha's not like a god that you can reach, etc., etc., etc. So when I read the book, I thought, yeah, Anand, he's just sort of loved Buddha, but didn't really understand him. But then I was having this feeling that Buddha was looking at me, and I remembered that, and I thought, well, who really knew Buddha better, Anand or the guy who wrote that book? And obviously Anand did. So why am I believing the guy who wrote this book and not Anand? And now it's true that what the guy who wrote the book said corresponded to what my own opinion, but my own opinion had been completely wrong every time until now. So why should I think it now? And if they always talk about nirvana is beyond time and space, it's sort of a platitude, beyond time and space. Yeah, okay. Well, what if that's really true? What is nirvana? Well, to an ignorant person like me, nirvana is now. And what is beyond space? It's here. So if Buddha really is in nirvana, that's here now. So maybe he really is here, you know? And maybe my own way of understanding things is completely inadequate. I would really, and that made an impression on me, you know? Anyway, I could talk a long time about that. But then this trip ended, and I got back and went to college.
Before you
yeah,
finish your trip,
yeah.
did your parents during this trip, did they have any interaction with you, ask you any questions, or?
I was, you know, this was the 60s, and you know,
The rebellion day.
Rebellion and
drop out.
drop out. And I was sitting in the car and behaving tolerably, and that was good. It wasn't their fault. I would never talk about anything that I was really.
How did they like camping out at all these places?
Oh,
was it their lifestyle?
Yeah, they were very much into that, and so was I. You know, we'd camp in like Rocky Mountain National Park or these beautiful, beautiful places.
Mm.
So, but they knew that something was going on in my head, but they had no idea what it was.
When did, before you go on, and I have to wait so long to get to that part, and I might forget to ask, did they ever find out what was going on?
Not exactly. They found out about Baba, which is where it all led to. But I never did talk about all of that.
But they saw, once Baba entered your life, they saw like a resolution of.
Oh, they sure did.
Of this deep,
yeah.
troubled
yeah.
faith that they sensed
right.
and saw in you.
Oh, there was no doubt about it before this. Already, it was much, much improved ever since I heard of Buddha. I mean, they knew I was interested in Buddha. I had books and stuff like that. I just wouldn't talk about it. They were such troglodytes, you know, like in the Mark Twain story, how in 60 my parents didn't know anything. They still didn't know anything at that time. By the time they were 25, they had learned a lot.
So how long was your trip? How long did you travel all over?
It was about 2 months or so, but it seemed like a long time. It made a big impression. The beauty of the scenery was really a part of it. I was really quite taken by the spectacular beauty of the west of America. You know, we went through Colorado and Wyoming and down California and the New Mexico and Utah, the Utah deserts. So it really made quite an impression. And then every night I would be out there and looking at Buddha. And there was this constant, as I say, strange feeling that when I wasn't even thinking about it, I would feel Buddha was looking at me. And there was something about it that I guess I didn't want to push it away, you know. I somehow felt it was real, you know, even though it didn't fit in with my beliefs at all, as I was saying, you know. But it really led me to start questioning a lot of that. I was no longer quite the rigid, dogmatic, fire-breathing atheist that I had been. I sort of thought, well, God is, you know, sort of a stupid people's way of talking about these sorts of things, you know. But I didn't actually believe there was anything like God. But then suddenly I was feeling this presence of Buddha, and it started to make me feel that my whole perspective maybe was wrong. So then I went back, we got back home, and I started going to college, and I was taking classes, and I would be fasting, training for my career as a beggar. I hadn't yet told my career plans to my parents or anything. And then actually I was roommates with another high school student who has also got into Harvard, who was the one who had told me about Zen Buddhism. And one day we were coming back from Harvard Square, and those were the days, yeah, there were still hippies and people crashing all the time. 1970, I mean, you may, Judy, you may remember that kind of time. There were all these sorts of hippie bums all over, I don't know, not quite bums, hippies all over the place. So we were coming back from Harvard Square, and I just bought the Rolling Stone magazine. And I just bought one and not looked at it. I had it under my arm, and we came into the dormitory, and my friend said, "Oh, there's Meher Baba. He says that he's the Buddha." And there was a poster of Baba on the bulletin board, and of course I went because I knew that Buddha said he was going to be coming back as the Maitreya Buddha. And I had been thinking, this is the sort of time that he would come. So I went and looked at it, and I was expecting somebody very young or ageless or no wrinkles on his face because he had transcended suffering, you know, these stupid ideas. And it was that 1966 passport photo, just the shot of Baba. And he's very not young at all, and I could see there was a lot of suffering in it, but I could also see that it looked like it was not selfish suffering. It wasn't quite what I had imagined, but anyway, there was just a second I looked at it, and there was a lecture, LSD, Consciousness, and Meher Baba was the title, something like that. And it was a lecture by Alan Cohen. And Alan Cohen had been a graduate student at Harvard a few years before that. This was 1970, so it was only 6-7 years before. And he had been a doctoral student under Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, who were the pioneers in LSD. So of course, an LSD was big in those days. And I had never taken LSD because even when life was meaningless and I was going to commit suicide, I didn't take LSD because I heard it might be bad for your health.
Might be what?
Bad for your health. All these stupid contradictions. But finally, I had decided, okay, I'm going to take LSD and search for nirvana. I probably would have done it that weekend or maybe the next weekend. And at Harvard in those days, getting LSD was like getting water, it was everywhere. So it was on my mind anyway. And so I decided to go. And actually, my dormitory, everybody went. But
To Alan's talk?
yeah, but I didn't want to go with them, so I sort of snuck off and I'm glad I didn't, because they probably would have been snickering and saying stupid things. But I went on my own, and the hall was full. It was one of the biggest lecture halls at Harvard. I would say there were 1,000 people there. It was, there's a balcony upstairs and the whole thing downstairs. And
What part did you sit in?
I think I was downstairs, yeah. And Alan spoke for, I don't know, an hour, I suppose. And he's very good with a crowd like that. And he was quite straight about it. I mean, I really admire it. He gave the Baba's message on LSD, which was not what people wanted to hear at all. But he said that Meher Baba said he was God in human form. And I didn't say this. Before going, I decided I was going to go to that talk, so I went up to my room with my roommate, the same one who mentioned Baba to me and had mentioned Zen Buddhism earlier. And I opened up the Rolling Stone, and the cover story was about Baba. It was an article by Pete Townsend on, I think, getting straight with Meher Baba or something like that. And so, of course, I read it. I mean, I knew as soon as I saw that poster that the most important thing in my whole life was to determine if this is true, if he is the Buddha. So I read this article, and there's a quotation from Baba's message, The Highest of the High, where Baba says something like, I'm not a Satpurush or a Wali or a Pir or a Mahatma. And then later on, Baba says, I am the Ancient One, the Highest of the High. And when I read that, it was as if somebody rang a bell in me that I hadn't even known was there. And I didn't even think it, but it was so clear that that was Buddha's voice. And no one but Buddha would have said that. I didn't even think it. It was very clear. It was completely clear. So when I went to this lecture and Alan Cohen was saying Baba said he was God, it was a shock. But I just felt anything Meher Baba says is true. And if he says he's God, well, I guess God exists. So that answered it for me. And at the end of the lecture, it was so clear that feeling has, that clarity, I'll say, of who Baba is, has never left me until this day. I'd say there's never been any shadowing of the feeling that came. So at the end of the lecture, I just wanted more, So I went down, and there was a whole line of people asking Alan questions, and I don't know if you know what Harvard pinhead intellectuals are, but I sure do. And I later, not just Harvard, the whole intellectual art. Well, if Meher Baba never tried LSD, how could he know that it's harmful mentally, physically, and spiritually? And Alan would say, well, you see, if he's God in human form, he would know. And of course, if he's not God in human form, why are you concerned about him in the first place? And answering questions like that, which to me were like beside the point. Finally, I was the only one left in the line, and Alan sort of looked up at me, and it's really funny. I just wanted more. I could have said, do you have meetings? Or is there a book I could read? Or can I meet, something like that? That's all but I couldn't think of a single question. Here I had all these years, going through, at Harvard, you question anything and everything, and especially things like this. But I couldn't think of a single question. So I just got embarrassed, and I went back to my room. And I would do a meditation in those days. And so didn't do my usual meditation, but I lit this candle, and I just knew I had been born to follow Meher Baba.
Wow.
And that, as I say, it was so clear that clarity has never gone from that moment until this one, I would really say. So that's how I came to Baba.
I don't think I ever heard all those details of your story. It's absolutely fascinating. I've heard parts of it, but not all the details. So then, do you want to go forward now into? So you stayed in school.
Yeah.
Oh, did your parents know anything about when this happened to you? Did you ever talk to them about Baba after this?
Oh, I told them all about Baba right off the bat.
Tell me what happened and what they say.
Well, trying to persuade me of anything was hopeless from their point of view. So they were just hoping for the best. And Bob, being a Baba lover now, I was much more compassionate towards my ignorant parents than I had been. So that was a big improvement. So they were willing just to accept the improvements and hope that I would outgrow it. And gradually, of course, I came to realize what an obnoxious, arrogant asshole I'd been, and you grow older, so it happened to me too. But actually, I went to India the first time in 1972 in the summer, and my mom came with me, and my brother did too.
Your mother and your brother? Now, in the 70s, when you heard Alan talk
November.
and all of this happened.
Actually, it was the anniversary of Baba's visit to Boston. Baba went to Boston once, and it was the anniversary of that, November
The
27th.
talk was the anniversary?
Yeah, yeah. And it was a huge talk. A lot of Baba lovers, I can't remember right now who, but came to Baba then, or it was one of the first times. A lot of the people you know, it really drew a large audience. So once, very quickly, I went to the center. Alan Cohen had mentioned the center. So actually, it's kind of funny. I knew about the center, but I had no idea how to find out about it. And my roommate and I were taking in people who were crash padding. I don't know if you remember that, but people would just come up and say, hey, can I have a place to sleep? And we had a rule that if anybody ever asked for that, we would always say yes. So every third night, there'd be somebody in our dormitory room. And so my roommate one day said, oh, there's somebody with us tonight. I said, okay. And he said, oh, by the way, he knows about Mira Baba. And he was going under the name Joseph in those days, but it was Walter Witkowski, you know Walter Witkowski? Mm-hmm. And his hair was down to there, and he was sort of a street bum with this very bright face. And he knew all about the center, and he had the address right in his wallet. So I got all the information. So as soon as...
Before we go to that, what impact did any of this have on your roommate? The one who first mentioned Baba to the one who told you about Zen Buddhism.
He wound up getting kind of put off. You know, because I had really, this was it for me, and he didn't quite like that, you know. So he wound up becoming a Buddhist, actually, for a while.
They did what?
He wound up becoming a Buddhist for a while.
Oh.
But we very quickly became estranged and went our own separate ways.
So with Walter
gave me all the information about where the center was and what the address was and how to find it and all those things. So as soon as the end of the semester came, which at Harvard in those days was late January, I drove down with my brother, actually, my older brother.
Was he a Baba lover, or did he ever become one, or just
my younger brother was the one who went to India with me, but my older brother drove down to Myrtle Beach with me. And my older brother, he never really took it seriously, but he liked it, you know, it was cool, you know, it was nice. So we stayed there, and of course I met, you know, Kitty and Elizabeth and Jane, and once I came back to Cambridge, Boston area, there are a lot of Baba lovers there, and I got in touch with them and started going to the group, and so I was very plugged in from that time on. So, and I would go to Myrtle Beach every 2 or 3 months. And Kitty was always saying, oh yes, and when are you going to India? So I wound up with my mom and brother going to India in
What did your
72.
parents think about you going to Myrtle Beach?
It's still the hippie or post-hippie era where there's a lot of that kind of thing going on. And I don't know if they were wildly enthusiastic about it, but it didn't seem to be doing any harm. And they did go, my dad too, and could see these old ladies, I mean, Kitty, Elizabeth.
Very reserved, very...
Right.
Yeah.
They weren't bomb throwers. So it seemed like it was probably okay. So my parents... so
they had met Kitty and Elizabeth.
Yeah, they did.
Jane
and Margaret too, as a matter of fact.
And Margaret,
yeah,
and they stayed on the center.
Yeah, they did.
They liked the center?
Yeah, they did. They did. My dad was a scientist, so that generation of scientists was very scornful of religion and things like that. So I think that was his point of view too. But I think he in particular just sort of hoped I would grow out of it after a while, but unfortunately I never have.
So how is it now that your mother and your younger brother ended up coming to India with you? What's the story there?
Well, I paid for them to come and just urged them to come.
This was your first trip?
My first trip, yeah. And I think my mom had met Kitty, and Kitty might have said to her, yes, when are you going to India? You know, so that might have helped. So she just sort of said yes for some reason. And so we were 6 weeks at Vila Vila in those days.
How did you get to India? Was it a lot more difficult those days? Not as easy.
Yes.
You flew, but you had to have connecting flights and the old funky airport and
Yeah.
terrible roads. And
Yeah, we stayed, it was because of my mom, we stayed in the Taj Mahal Hotel. So it was a nice hotel, which in those days was more affordable than now. And we took a train, and we met Jal in Pune, and Mirji was gone, but his daughter was there. And so a lot of those things, people helped us to arrange for it. And then we stayed with Sarosh was still alive at Vila Villa, so we stayed there. And we got there on June 15th, and we were the only ones there for a few days. So we saw a lot of the Mandalay. And of course, they are so good with, 1972, there hadn't been all that many.
there weren't that many people.
Yeah.
So your mother met Mani and Mara and all the women in Mandalay.
Oh, yeah.
And they must have just fussed over her.
Oh, yeah. And of course, she liked it. And when she would be in a Baba environment, she would just sort of accept it and take to it and like it, and didn't really think about it a whole lot. When she would get back home, it would gradually fade away like that. My brother, when he got back, he's a scientist himself, really fine man, but I think he sort of thought about it, and if Baba says that he's Jesus, not that he was a Christian either, but Jesus says this and Baba said that, and how do you answer the contradiction? He would, those sorts of things would come up. So he wound up rejecting Baba, actually, after about a year or two. He was only, 14, and I was the older brother, so he was kind of under my influence a bit. But as he got to be 16, he got out of my influence and sort of rejected Baba.
But he got to meet all the Mandalay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of times.
Most of the men Mandalay were still around at that time.
Oh yeah, they were. We'd spend the long days at Mirazat were there.
Yeah.
We'd hang out and.
They must have just doted on him.
Yeah.
He was a young kid.
Yeah. No, it was really wonderful. It was a wonderful visit.
And your mother, the love she must have got. Oh my God, imagine Mani.
Yeah.
Mani being so delighted to see her and all, and just.
Yeah.
She had tea with them and things.
Yeah, actually, my brother and I had tea in the house with Mara back in those days. Later on, that never happened, and in the women's arty, we would go into the Samadhi with Mara too. Those rules
came about later when more and more people came.
Very soon after that, yeah, all that changed.
There were so few buildings in those days.
Yeah. It was starting to rev up. We were there for 6 weeks, and even by the end of the 6 weeks, there were a lot more people there then. But it was still new to the Mandalay. They weren't so I won't say, it was very tiring for them, as you know. But this was a fresh
went
new.
on and there's never-ending stream.
Never ending. It wasn't like that yet. It was still quite a new thing.
Still fresh.
Yeah.
Wow.
So from then on, I didn't get back until 1976, but then I would come every year or two. By 1976, the scene was very different. There were a lot of people all the time, and
was David Fenster or any of the residents living here yet? Not yet. They came the next year.
Yeah.
By 77, I think a few had moved here.
76, I think.
They might have come but not lived here.
I don't think anyone was living here. I can't quite remember that trip specifically.
Even Jack in Virginia, I don't think came before.
Yeah, I came back in 77, and by that time, some people, Bob Street might have been here, and
Jacko.
Yeah, like that.
Jack in Virginia.
And I came again in 79, maybe. So there was quite a scene of blossoming by that time. I would come all the time.
A little community.
Yeah. And then after I graduated, I went to Myrtle Beach and worked at Cherry Press for a couple of years, and I was right there at the center. So, I was very much in the East Coast Baba scene there.
Now maybe you will, let me see how this is going here. Stop on me.
It was just half hour.
No, it's still going. Maybe you can touch on how your direction
Yeah.
for your doctorate turned out to be something so useful for here.
Yeah.
Tell a little bit about that.
Yeah, I worked for 2 years at Sharia Press, and then that came to an end, and I didn't.
You had already graduated?
Yeah, I graduated in
So
'74.
And were you taking like a sabbatical before you went to go for your master's?
No, I had no such plans at all. I got
You
a
go
job.
back.
I had a job at Sharia Press. I never wanted to go into academia. Not only did I not have the desire, it was a hateful idea to me. I really wanted not to do it. And so after I graduated, I went down to Myrtle Beach and lived there. But then after that ended, it was obvious I was going to have to do something. And my parents came down. My dad, impressed on me how I should go to graduate school. So I sort of thought, okay, I should listen to my parents, since I don't have a clear direction myself. So I went back and I applied to graduate schools. And
where did you go for that? Harvard or somewhere else?
no, I went to Emory, and then I had a professor who was just an assistant professor, but was obviously a real rising star, and he got a really good position at the University of Missouri. So I went there, which was a real step down in terms of prestigious schools. He turned out to be quite a superstar, actually. So it was a risk. So I got a doctorate there, and then I got
University of Missouri.
At Columbia, yeah.
Columbia.
And then I got.
Columbia is in New York.
But there's one in Missouri, right in the middle of the state.
Is it connected? Is it a branch of Columbia?
No.
It's just the same name.
Yeah. And then I wound up, getting my PhD in as a medieval English literature, which is, the job market had really crashed by then for people in literature, and medieval literature was the worst field of all. And in medieval literature, I was in Old English, which was the worst part of medieval literature. So it was a really unemployable
position.
Yeah.
And yet you had all that training, a certain way to study.
Well, I certainly did. When I went back to graduate school, what I decided was I had a very low opinion, and still do, frankly, of the intelligentsia. And I felt they were very anti-spiritual and would be very hostile to anything that I wasn't doing. I felt that Baba wanted me to do it. There's a whole big story to that, but I felt that Baba was directing me to go back into it, which I did not want to do at all. With a passion, I didn't want to do it. And it was against all of what I liked. But I felt Baba was...
and you were raised in that world.
Yeah, but I really am very critical of it. Then too, so I wound up going, and I sort of felt, okay, I'm not going to get any fulfillment out of this. This isn't something I want to do. So I'm not going to.
Let me stop for a minute. Let me change tape. It's letting me know that it's time to change. There's water if you're thirsty, Lord.
Oh yeah, this is the season of drinking.
Yeah. And I've got electrolytes over here.
Yeah. Although we've had a little bit of a respite from the heat.
It's nice, this little washing of the leaves and the patting down some of the dust. And did you notice, while we're waiting to change this, did you notice over on the other side of the tracks they've started the underground?
Oh, have they?
Yeah. On the underground, the tracks, the pedestrian motorcycle underneath. They started about 4 or 5 days ago. I was
We are not here. It's okay.
yeah, I'm changing tape.
But here,
I saw them in the morning. I saw a backhoe when I come back down the hill. I saw a backhoe.
it because for all these various reasons, which I haven't gone into, I felt Baba was directing me to. So I thought, okay, well, what I would have liked to do was to study, you know, mystics and spirituality and all those things. That was but there's no point in that. No one is interested. I'll never get a job in those things. So what I said, what I'll do is, when a door opens, I'll go through it. Wherever, you know, that an opening is there, I'll follow it. And that wound up, I very quickly had a really good connection with this professor, and all that was opening up. So I wound up going into the things he was specializing in. And I see
And
now.
he was specializing in what?
He was in Old English was his branch of English literature, but he also he died about 3 years ago. Brilliant. He became quite a superstar.
Did you stay in touch with him over the years?
Well, that's a later story. Once I left academia, I just disappeared. I did get in touch with him at the end, but also Greek and also oral tradition. There's a whole, I could really talk about this, but it turns out that this is very relevant to Baba. Very, very, not the Greek and the Old English, but this part was linguistics. I had to get a training in linguistics and how to handle language. Now the editing work I'm doing involves Gujarati and Urdu and all those things.
Linguistics.
So, yeah, so how to handle, and also in medieval studies in particular, you get a training in textual study, and which is big part of that is editing, because in medieval literature you're dealing with original manuscripts that have to get edited, so everybody gets a certain training in that. So I wound up getting all this. I would never have studied those things of my own choice, but I was just doing this because, you know, I was being, Baba had thrown me to the wolves, so okay, this is what's there, so I'll learn it. And then I got my PhD and I was trying to get a job, and jobs were impossible to get. I applied, this is before word processing, I had to type out letters. I must have typed out 150 two-page letters, and for terrible jobs, nothing to do with my field of study at all, completely. The sort of job that if I got a job offer, I'd say yes and then go shoot myself, you know, like that. And but then there was a job at LSU, the Louisiana State University, and this was a plum of a job. And so somehow I got an on-campus interview. So I went to the interview. I couldn't get any job offers from these terrible jobs, awful. I could explain it all, but won't take the time. And this was an absolute plum. And it was the last day of the job interview, and the chairman of the department was taking me to the airport. And usually you'd go back home, and then a couple weeks later, you'd find out, you know, and usually the answer would be no. But at the airport, he said they were offering me the job. And get this, it was Amartiti Day noon.
If they were offering, what year?
That would have been 83. So, you know, I had been feeling, you know, Baba, I only went into this line because I felt you wanted me to. All I want to do is live in Myrtle Beach or live in India. I don't want any of this. And you've just thrown me out into the desert and don't care about me. You know, that kind of feeling I was having. So this was like a clear sign, you know, getting a job, a plum of a job, getting the job offer at Amartiti Day at noon. So, so I wound up becoming a professor. So I did that for 8 or 9 years, and I really got a training in these things, linguistics. Oral tradition is kind of relevant to it also, because Baba didn't write exactly. Baba would dictate, and someone would interpret his gestures and write down what he had said and write it up. And actually, my professor's specialization, oral tradition, and the boundaries between oral discourse and written discourse. that was his very specialization. He was one of the pioneers, one of the world's leading. And there are other people I work, who are mentors of mine, who are the world's leading scholars in precisely this field, which is very germane to all that I'm doing with Baba's words and the editing of Baba's words. So though I had no idea of it at the time, I was actually getting a training that was perfect for what I do now. So now when I look back, I can see that Baba was actually at the driver's seat all the way along from the very beginning. Although at the time I had no idea of it. So this really has been for me a great living example that Baba really does guide our lives. And we really are under his watchful care. I can see it in my own life perfectly. I got a training for the work I do now that I would never have picked for myself, even if I had known that I was going to be doing this, and who would ever have imagined it? It's not work that was being done here at the Trust or anywhere else at that time. So then after, I did very well in academia. I was, very well published. I had a book from Princeton University Press. That's always a big deal. And then suddenly, Baoji I got a letter saying he was asking me to come and be his secretary along with Freeman Bamer. And I had been, even though I was a
Which
professor.
year?
Let's see, I think this was 1992, maybe November, December or something. And I had, even though I was a professor, and I was saying that I did very well, I was very well published and all of that, but the truth is I didn't like it. I don't like that world. The people were good, but the intellect is so perverted nowadays that I really disliked intensely the universe. Everything that I had not wanted to go into academia for was exactly as I had imagined it to be, except only worse. There's no love of the truth, there's no love of beauty, it's all this kind of perversity. So the truth is I found it, the whole scene, odious. And I was living in Louisiana, far away from Baba lovers, so it wasn't a career I liked. And so I got suddenly this invitation from Bao to come and be his secretary, and I just felt clear as a bell. Baba was saying, okay, you've been complaining all these years, you've been wanting to live in India. Are you coming or are you not? And at the time I really had no money, I don't know, $20,000 or something like that. So, but I just felt, okay, if this invitation is from Baba, my answer is yes. So I just quit my job. And actually I happened to be I won't go to the whole story, but on a fellowship. I was away from the university that year. And so I just told them I was taking a year's leave of absence. And like in The Hobbit, how Bilbo would just put on a magic ring and disappear. That's what I did. I just disappeared from the academic scene and never told anybody what happened to me. And
but you ended after that year notifying them, right?
Yeah, they wound up getting in contact, and I said, no, I'm not coming back. And I never told anybody what the reason is, and I never made contact, except with my mentor professor. I did, right at the end, just before he died.
You told him what?
Well, I just got in touch. He never really asked all that much. I don't know, that whole world, they wouldn't have.
What did you say to him? That you were living in India this whole time? And...
Yeah. He didn't ask very much.
Worked with Baoji. You came here and started to work
Yeah,
here.
I came here. It was
And
about
how was it, experience?
But wait a minute, but your professor must have been very grateful. He must have been happy because all those years you probably wondered what happened to you.
Yeah, he was.
So,
and actually, he was inviting me to come back and give a lecture and all of that. But by that time, he had cancer. So he wound up dying before I could get back in touch with him. But it was nice to make that link
For
again.
him, yeah, it fulfilled for him before he died
Yeah.
a wish to know what happened to this person who he had
Yeah.
such a strong connection with. And
Yeah,
he
I was
so
his
helpful.
first student, and he always said that I was his best student too, all those years.
That
So
was a
that link,
wonderful thing.
it made that link again. It was a very nice connection. But all the rest of the academic world, I just felt it can take care of itself without me.
So you came and Baoji said, come and you lived at the trust. Or did you,
Yeah.
at first you lived at the trust?
Yeah, I was there for about 6-7 years. And I just felt the whole...
You didn't get a day off at first, did you?
No. And it had nothing to do with anything literary. I just sort of took for granted that it was like a different lifetime. I didn't even think about it, that's over. And I was glad for it to be over, to tell the truth. I wasn't wanting to do anything like that. But then all of a sudden, these manuscripts came to light.
The ones that were found at Mirasai?
Yeah, I mean, Erich, Balna II Erich had sent Balna II, right after Baba dropped the body, to the rice go down at Mirasai, one of those little small rooms in the back where they kept rice in those days. And he found this briefcase.
He sent, wait a minute, Erich sent Balna II there? Why did he send Balna II there?
I don't know. I don't suppose Erich would ever go back there. This was like, right after Baba dropped the body. And I don't know why, maybe Bala's... I never got a real answer to that. I would guess Erich must have had some idea that something was there.
Yeah, that's what I...
Because why would you go to the rice go down? But there was this briefcase that was a treasure trove.
Where did you find it?
Somewhere in the rice go down.
Buried under something?
I don't know. I never heard. But it had infinite intelligence. It had the Tiffin lectures, and it had Baba's talks to the Mir Ashram boys. So that's an unbelievable treasury, actually. And they brought it to Erich, who anyway, there's a whole lot.
Was Erich surprised?
I don't. Well,
Or he probably knew and sent him there.
I mean, I only heard about this from Merwan. I never bugged Erich about this. This was the last years of Erich's life. But Merwan said that when he was living in Pune, when he came to Nagar not long after that, Erich said, I'm too busy. Could you take a look at this and tell me what you think of it? Because everybody was asking, where's the book, and where's the book, and does this have something to do with the book? So Merwan read through it, and Erich said, well, what do you think about the book? And Merwan made an extremely sensible response. He said, well, since I haven't read the book, I couldn't tell you what it is in relation to the book. So Erich said, okay. And Erich had so much going on, and old manuscripts were not in the program then. It was the living memory of Baba, people coming to pilgrims, giving them the feeling of Baba's presence. All that was the agenda. Reading an old manuscript was not something any of the Mandali had any interest in. But then I moved here in 1993 because Bao had invited me to come. And and Merwan came to live here just shortly before that. And Erich, when Merwan moved here, Erich would give him this things again to look at, and he read it more closely. And Merwan said, well, there's content of great value here, great interest and value. So Erich would just say, okay. And Merwan would bring it up from time to time. But finally, we had created a publication committee. This was 1997 by this time. And Merwan finally went to Erich and said, well, there are people now who could actually work on this. If this were ever to get published, it would be better if it were to start while you Mandali are still alive. Do you want anything to be done with this? And Erich said, well, if you think that it would be a benefit to Baba's lovers, and if it doesn't contain contradictions that would really upset people, go ahead. So at our next, we had a publication committee, and we're dealing with kind of routine small business as usual. And right at the end of, this was maybe May or June 1997, right at the end of the meeting, we were about to go, and Merwin said, oh, before you go, I have something I want to bring up. And he introduced this. And
Who did this, Merwan or Bona too?
Merwan. And of course it was mind-blowing. So immediately.
This was infinite intelligence.
Yeah, that was the first thing we started working on. All 3 manuscripts were there, but that was the one we started with. And Ba was in America on tour then, but when he heard about it, he was absolutely thrilled. And when I got back from America, I had Eric Nadel was very involved and got the whole thing typed up, and Eric really did a very most helpful work of many kinds. I'm still using it actually. And but Bao, when I got back, Bao immediately wanted to just focus on these things. So he completely closed his office. No one could call, even though he was chairman then, no one could call or no one could come into the office between 9 and 2 every day. And we just spent the whole time on these manuscripts. And with that year, Bao signed off on it. And then Merwan and I started going up to Marazad, and we started working on infinite intelligence. And so since then, that's been, Infinite Intelligence then was published, and Tiffin Lectures was another of the manuscripts. And now I'm working on Baba's talks to the Meher Ashram boys, which are December and January 1927-28, and they are dynamite.
Wow.
They're not talks to kids at all. They're profoundly significant. They're mind-blowing, actually. So that's, and that with that will finish.
When did you start on that?
Well, I mean, with Bao, we did a quick run through it all, actually, even back then.
We've got a lot of time.
So, but I really, it was,
How do you finish them all?
well, just a quick pass, a quick run through them all. I mean, actually, it takes much, much more than that. Real editing, you
Like
have,
super rough draft.
yeah. I mean, real editing, you have to do it to find out what's entailed. Every single word, all the source background manuscripts, all the histories, all the language and linguistics. It's sort of hard to explain it, but it's done properly. But you see, I had the training. Those were the editions that I worked with as a medievalist.
And that is such,
So I knew
like
very well.
one
Yeah.
on the whole planet.
I know it's a
you know, it's
freakish.
like
To come
freakish.
here with that specialization is freakishly unlikely. I mean, nobody does that. How many Beowulf specialists are there, you know, who are going to come here and live in India? And not just Beowulf, you were out of the room, but I had this particular training in, it's hard to explain, but orality and literacy. My professor and a handful of others who I worked with closely were the world's leading specialists in this subject. And Baba actually fits right into that because he didn't write. He would dictate, and out of this books would come, and that was the very subject that these people I was working with, that dynamic was, they had just opened up that field. So I worked with the world's leading scholars in precisely that subject, which is completely relevant to this. You know, where Baba was, you know, he would dictate something and somebody would note it down and the person would read it back and Baba would work on it. Well, that dynamic between live discoursing and writing was the very exact thing my professor was a specialist in, and me too. I became one of the scholars.
One of these scholars of the world.
Yeah,
on that.
yeah.
And now
So
you're
my
here.
God, it was so. So I don't have those kind of literary biases, you know, written discourse biases, because that field was criticizing that, looking at live discourse and its relations to the recording of it. So unbelievable training for exactly what I'm doing. I mean, who would ever have thought of it? There wasn't even such a field, actually, when I first went back to graduate school. It just came into being during that very time. So,
and he does everything so natural.
Yeah, yeah. You know, the whole time I had felt Baba was just throwing me to the wolves, when in fact, Baba was giving me exactly the training I needed to do this work. So his guidance right now is crystal clear, and that he really does know better than we do. He knows what we need much better than we do. I know that I mean, I can see it without a doubt when I look back in my life.
So Infinite Intelligence is finished. The Tiffin Diaries are finished, both of which you travel to the Baba centers around the world to give seminars on. And now you're starting to work on the talks that
to the Mir Ashram boys.
They're not even talks, you could say, because they are more enlightened discourses.
Yeah, they are. It's an organized series.
Because every now and then we get to read something somewhere in some book that he had said to them.
Snippets
it
are
wasn't,
there.
you couldn't call them discourses. They're more than that.
Yeah.
And so how big is that? How many pages do you think that'll be? And how long do you think it'll, before it's ready for publication, how long do you think it'll take?
Yeah, right in midway, I'd say, in that project.
You're midway through right now?
Something like that.
How,
another couple years.
How many pages do you estimate will come out of that?
It won't be quite as long as Tiffin lectures, I'd say. The actual talks themselves are not that long. It'll be, maybe 2 or 220 pages worth of that. But it's going to need context.
I was going to say, are there any commentary throughout the book on it?
Yeah, there will have to be. For one thing, these talks were given at the dynamic period. I don't know if you remember the stories of the Prem Ashram and all that happened. That whole explosion happened. These talks were given over 6 weeks. Right in the middle of that time, all this happened. They start on, the first of them is dated, they're all dated 2nd December 1927, and the last is 14th January 1928. And it was right middle of December. Baba would, it was up at the Samadhi. Baba would be in what's now the Samadhi, the crypt room. And he would come out in the north window and would discourse out through that, and the boys would all be gathered.
The north or the east?
Well, let's see.
I guess it'd be the east. It'd be the east window.
I guess it'd be the east window, yeah.
That's when they had the
facing the
meditation
Sabamanda, yeah, with the meditation. And actually, they had the meditation chambers were there, and there were 5 men in them right then. And Baba was
during some of the monks they were in there during the time that he would have to the spiritual ashram.
I imagine that those men would come out and listen too. I haven't seen it, but I would think they would. And I imagine anybody in the ashram who didn't have some other duty would be there. These would be in the evenings. Baba would do this, and they're not random, haphazard talks at all. They're a very clear. It's almost like a course syllabus. There's a clear organization and succession of them all. Not like the Tiffin lectures. The Tiffin lectures aren't like that, but these are. And also, they're not the sort of thing you would imagine for kids at all. Who these kids must be? They must be the hierarchy of the next 700 years. It's
they were not the normal kids.
I mean, in another lifetime, this would come back to them, I bet. But a primordial cosmology, things you've never heard of before. The planes of consciousness and the asmans, the skies associated with the planes of consciousness, what's there. he has a whole 2 or 3 talks on the sun and the earth and the moon. You've never heard anything like this before.
Well, can you tell a little bit?
It's positively weird. It must have to do with the relation between the gross sphere and the subtle sphere. But there are all these, Baba called them light globes. And I think they must be subtle sphere. And a light globe casts a shadow. And the shadow is a world like the earth. And the shadow the shadow is not pure darkness, it's the faintest of faint light, as the shadow of the light globe. And it casts its reflection out into the emptiness. And that reflection is mirrored in the emptiness. That's the sun. And the sun catches the light from the light globe. The shadow doesn't. If a shadow got the light...
The light globe is the moon?
I think the light globe, it must be something not in the physical plane.
Physical plane.
That's what I think, because it makes no sense otherwise. And so the earth or the world cannot catch the direct light of this light globe because a shadow will cease to exist. But the reflection can. So the sun, the reflection of the world in the emptiness catches the light from the light globe, which shines it back on the world, and that reflection of the earth is the sun. Have you ever heard anything like that before?
No, but no. I'm going to really have to be able to comprehend it.
No, you have to spend time with it. It's too
But I do
weird.
Feel that I read somewhere. I mean, it's like when you're reading things and you see something so unique that Baba has said, and you'll just find it here or you'll find it there. And then you wish, oh God, I wish I would have written down the page. You think you'll remember it, but I feel that I remember Baba saying something about the stars and something to do with the earth. But I can't quite, I know the moon was an over, but I can't quite remember what it is he was said about. There was something about those stars and
well, this comes with all these diagrams. In fact, I mean, it's much more complicated than what I've just said, which is already complicated enough. But there wind up being 3 earths and 7 suns, and Baba would illustrate it by having a light and then 3 mirrors, and he would show this to all the boys. So I mean, he was really demonstrating.
But do you think that 7, 3 earths and 7 suns could be reflected in the inner planes? Because Baba explains how on the inner world, on the mental and subtle, new earths are being created, and so when this one goes, and that one of the ones that's been prepared comes in its place.
Yeah, I know he does talk about that
he
too.
Talks about
This is the place where he really. But this anyway, how to interpret this will be the greatest philosophers will be battering their heads on this for the next. And he gave it to this bunch of kids. Or
they might have been able to see it.
The thing is, I've thought about this a lot. About you would think this would be content way beyond a bunch of boys in their early teens. But I think that's not the case. The grammar is not that complicated. The language is not that complicated. It's the ideas that are so sublime. But in fact, I remember Gil Alvarado, who had a real connection with Chuggan, Baba's disciple Chuggan, and Chuggan was there then. And Chuggan told Gil, I have to get him to write this out as best he remembers it, but that when Baba was with these boys, it's not like when he was with adults. He was self-evidently God. So I think he would be able to explain it to them where they would immediately see what he was talking about. Now, I think probably they wouldn't be able to remember it afterwards, but I think at the time...
This is speculation, of course. Baba would work through everybody and everything for his work and would however he does it. Now Baba talks about in the future man will be 5 inches tall. And man used to be 14 feet tall.
Mm.
And you know, and that there'll be so much energy and mind, it'll be mostly mind.
Mm.
So it's possible that when Baba's working with them with this knowledge, just like the knowledge of the evolution stuff wasn't for that time, it was more for our time.
Yeah, I think so.
And this other stuff may really be for something a couple of hundred years in the future where, because look at how all the young people, they are so much more aware of technology and how things work, and their mind is almost being rewired because of how they do. So it's very possible that it's working for the, it'd be wonderful if we can understand some of it, but it may not be for our time.
Yeah, actually, I think that a lot of this material Baba gave in the 20s is like that. Infinite intelligence, I think, is that way also. Although I do think we can begin to understand some of infinite intelligence now. And some of these talks, people will be able to understand. But I think it's...
I mean, God speaks, we can understand.
Right.
It's not,
And I think infinite intelligence...
I mean, it's so vast from what was known before.
I think infinite intelligence is intelligible now also. It takes real work.
I haven't read it yet.
I mean, it's a real labor to extract that from it, but I think it's possible. And from these talks to the boys, I think a lot can be understood, and more as time goes on. And I would imagine, I mean, it seems to me this relates to what you're saying, is that Baba was working archetypally, and these boys were archetypal.
Almost like an advanced knowledge, advanced awareness.
Yeah, it's very advanced. Baba hadn't told this to the the Mandali that I'd ever heard of. It seems to have been the first time to them that I know of anyway. So, I mean, one thing is that probably he was doing some act that will have cosmic repercussions. Also, these kids themselves will probably be major players in the next 700 years. They'll come back, and some of them will all of a sudden be, a
realized
genius,
or whatever.
or be a genius, or be an advanced soul, or will explain it all to everybody else. People will be puzzled, and somebody will come along and say, "But I know what that means because he was there."
And he won't. Maybe he'll know why he knew that, but he maybe, like you said, pure genius.
Right. So I think a lot of that, but I think a certain amount we could work out now. But a lot of this stuff is quite new. It doesn't contradict God speaks, but it adds a lot to it. So
Dimensions. Dimensions.
Yeah, whole dimensions, whole windows, whole perspectives on things. Like here's another thing Baba did when he gave them his account of the evolution of consciousness. Some of the things we hear about a little bit, but not very clearly, come from these talks that he gave then. But Baba, Baba has said in those days for the first time, and has said elsewhere, that there is only one form in creation, and that is the human form. Every single form is the human form not fully unfolded yet. Yeah, so like a stone is a human form, all folded in on itself. So Baba, to explain that, as he was telling them about evolution, had a little doll, and he would show it. I wish we had photographs. I mean, this is very difficult editing. A lot of it is because they wrote it down as best they could. But I'm sure when Baba was showing this process with the doll, you'd see a stone. And then suddenly you'd see a tree as the human form is on its head. And then a worm. I'm sure it would be so vivid when Baba would. And he did this. He was doing all this with the kids.
With the doll.
With the doll, to show evolution. He brought it out specifically. And he had all kinds of diagrams he would show them.
Now the diagrams you have.
I hope we do. We have a lot of diagrams, let's put it that way. And they must be from Baba. They must be. This is a really, really hard editing job. It's the hardest of all. So a lot of the diagrams.
Well, you've had a lot of training now.
Yeah, I know. I'm glad this comes last, but a lot of the three primary manuscripts have what are called lacunae, which is gaps in the manuscript. There's a page typed, and then it's all typed, and there'll be a big blank, and it was obviously intended for diagram. And some of the diagrams are there, and some of them are missing. But then there are other manuscripts we found that are analogs or are relevant one way or another. So I'm trying to, as best I can, ascertain whether any of them actually belong there, and I think some of them clearly do.
Some refer to the time period.
Oh yeah, they don't make reference, but they're genetically related. You can see the wording is in common, and they're derivative probably from the same notes.
Yeah, because you'd be trained to recognize that.
Yeah, that's the very thing. So I think a lot of the diagrams we've been able to fill in. There might be a couple missing, but mostly it'll be about 35 diagrams or so.
Mm.
So it's going to be it won't be all that long, but it'll be a substantial book, and it will be a book of major importance.
Have you thought of a name for it yet?
No. And as I say, it was right literally when Baba was giving these talks that whole explosion of love happened. Like one of the big days, these began on 2nd of December, and 10th of December, a lot of the boys were found to be crying, and on I think 21st of December there was a big eruption, and on January 1st they just started crying all day long, wailing without cease, you know. So Baba was giving talks every night right at this time. In fact, right at the end of December, Baba was giving these descriptions of the planes of consciousness. And it's not just the planes, they're called asmans, or they're affiliated skies or heavens connected with the planes. So he gave the names of them, and he said what's in them and all that kind of thing. And right then, within that very week, a bunch of these boys started experiencing the planes of consciousness. Those good students, huh?
Mm.
I mean, a teacher would love students
Sounds
like that.
like fun to me.
Yeah.
Fun.
So it was an unbelievable period of time, and these talks are right in the middle. But they're not. It's a funny thing. It's Baba isn't really talking about love mostly. He's talking about primordial cosmology, or he's talking about evolution, or all these unbelievably esoteric talk. I think this is full of secrets, spiritual secrets. But then at the end of it, he'll say, now, the thing I want you to remember is love. Just love. Love me more. And man, it was happening. So all of this is mixed together. There's even a 2 or 3 of the talks where...
I got it in 5 minutes. We'll wrap it up?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'll just say this last thing about these talks. The 2 or 3 of these talks where he was representing himself as a perfect master in those days. So Sri Sadguru, Mayor Baba
Not the
Ki Jai,
avatar.
yeah, avatar. But there are 2 or 3 where he pretty clearly implies that he's the avatar. That'd be one of the first times that he did it.
Remember what he said?
Well, it's kind of complicated to explain, but he's basically saying, this is your chance. He pretty clearly told them
I'm back again, sort of.
He pretty clearly told them they're not in the circle. These aren't circle members, but he said, I may give realization to 1 or 2 or any number, and I may bring them back down. So in the context of that, he was talking about avatar, and pretty strong implication that he was the avatar. So he let them know that. I mean, I think these kids were so enraptured that anything he said, they would have just been spellbound by. They'd be crying all day, and then when he showed up, suddenly they become quiet, you know. So it was an amazing scene. So this is the last of the three great manuscripts, and that's one heck of a briefcase, wouldn't you say, that all that you
Wow,
found?
and it sounds like it should have been a trunk.
Yeah, oh, it's just absolute dynamite.
And all those years it sat there.
Yeah.
Well, I want to ask you about your songwriting. You know, a professor, a scholar man, writes songs and sings and plays music.
Yeah.
How then did, you turn to the music?
Yeah, I've always done that
And I
since I was a
just wanted to
kid.
say that the
Yeah.
songs you wrote, at least once a day in Samadhi, someone is singing, or maybe more than one person.
Yeah,
And it's so
this is the
beautiful.
whole other side of you that,
And
even though we don't
your
have time.
songs, I'm sorry, and in your songs, there is one thing that I like it, that is philosophy still. You know,
Yeah.
it's not only love songs. It's not only saying Baba's name. There is
Yeah.
something in that. Is a teaching. You know, when we read it, we
Yeah.
learn something new. It's not just some, Baba was there, right? Love songs to Baba. Oh, Baba, you're
Yeah.
beautiful. Oh, Baba,
Right.
But your songs, your poems you write, it's philosophical. That's so
Yeah.
interesting. Look, then what happened? You turn philosophy, mix it with music, and then brought out something new, beautiful.
maybe when you come back, after I come back, you come back, and in June, or when you come back, July or August, maybe the next session we do is your artistic expression with Baba. This was your intellectual, your
Yeah.
training,
Yeah.
and how Baba's used it and all of that.
Mm.
But parallel to all of this is your creative spirit. And
Yeah,
as
it's been a big
Tara
part.
said,
Actually, I've also written poetry. I've
Yeah.
never read it, but I've written
but
hundreds
this
and
is
hundreds of
the
ghazals.
creative half of Ward.
Mm.
Ward is not just the intellectual scholar. Ward is the artist also, and that would be a wonderful whole series to do.
Yeah.
On your poetry, maybe
Yeah.
you can bring some.
Mm.
Maybe and if you want to bring your piano or anything and sing some of your songs, and if you need, we have our cars, we can pick you up and bring all your stuff here.
Mm-hmm.
I have keyboards. I have very good keyboard here.
Mm-hmm.
It is good, but we can do a whole thing on just the
Right.
creative part of your life that you have
Sure.
equally
Sure. Yeah. No, it's
Yeah.
huge.
shared
part of
with
my life.
Baba.
Could you
Equally,
today say
you know?
briefly something about
Just a
music
little
and
touch
music?
of
Well, I'll
teacher
say
part of
this.
music.
I'll say this, that I actually think that it's it has a real important relationship to this scholarship I'm doing. Because the big danger, one of the great dangers that comes with scholarly work is that it become dry and intellectual and lose the feeling. And I don't think that God speaks or Baba's teachings are that way. They're rich and deep and beautiful. But studying them, one can become dried up. So I do think in my own case, it's been really important to keep music and poetry alive in my life, so that I get up, I actually do the music and poetry early in the morning. I get up at 5 and do it so that that's all done before I go to work. And so there's a kind of a melodies are going through my mind and all of that. So I think it's a real
Which
important.
year you started?
Actually, I started that as a kid too, as a teenager.
Oh,
Yeah, so this is going to be the parallel, the artistic part of Ward that has been expressed all along. So we'll close up now. Dara, I really need to go. So we'll close up now. And Ward, thank you so much. And when we can, next pilgrim season, we'll do the whole music thing if that.